Well, hi, everybody. I'm so glad that I could see some of you. My name is Allison Powell, and I'm a park ranger at James A. Garfield National Historic Site, which I usually say is right down the street, except I'm about 20 minutes away from Garfield and the library right now. So normally, if we were at the library, we would only be down the street. So my presentation today is about Jefferson Davis. When I say Jefferson Davis, what kind of words come to mind? And since you're all on mute and I don't read lips that well, you don't have to speak them, but keep them in your mind because we're going to be digesting them a little bit later on. So think about some adjectives to describe Jefferson Davis. So as I introduce all my Civil War talks, I'll give you the caveat that I'm not here to talk about Civil War battles. This is not a battle talk. It's not really a war talk. It's more about Jefferson Davis, the person. We have many rangers at the Garfield site who are excellent at talking about and picking apart the battles. I'm more interested in the people that made those battles or participated in those battles. So what I'm going to do today is offer a different perspective on Jefferson Davis than maybe most of us, especially in the North, are used to learning about. And I'm going to share some strong character features that in other circumstances might have served him very well. And finally, I'd like to leave you a little bit better informed about Jefferson Davis, the only president of what was for a time the Confederate States of America. Before we get into the meat and potatoes here about Jefferson Davis, just humor me while we go back a number of years immediately following the end of the Civil War. If you were living in 1864 and you read the newspapers at all, I'm sorry, 1865. I don't know, my date's wrong up there. But anyways, if you read the newspapers in 1865, you would have been confronted with variations on this theme. Jefferson Davis was captured by Union forces on May 10th in Irwinville, Georgia. He was accused of treason and at the time thought to have been a part of the conspiracy to assassinate President Lincoln. There was a $100,000 reward for his capture. He was fleeing Danville, Georgia, the last Confederate capital, with his family and trusted advisors trying to reach safe harbor in Florida. The evening of May 9th, the party thought themselves a step ahead of their pursuers, but the next morning they woke to gunfire and Union troops surrounded their campfire. Jefferson Davis's wife convinced him to flee, though as a trained soldier, this was not his nature. He grabbed what he thought was his coat and a covering for his head to ward off the chill of the early morning air and left his tent running towards the creek near their camp. A member of the 4th Michigan Cavalry pursued Davis and captured him. At first, the soldier was reluctant to pursue him because of the figure's immediate appearance, which, as you can see on the slide, resembled that of a lady. In his haste, Davis actually grabbed his wife's cloak and shawl for his head. But when the soldier in pursuit saw the shining spurs on his boots, he ordered Davis to stop. And Davis knew at that point there was no getting away. But we'll talk about that later on. Jefferson Davis's background was typical enough for the times. He was born in Kentucky on June 8th of 1808, coincidentally just about 100 miles from Lincoln's birthplace, to Samuel Emory and Jane Cook Davis. When he was a young boy, his family moved to Mississippi, where they established Rosemont Plantation, but Davis did return to Kentucky for school. Samuel raised an independent thinker. He felt a healthy child's own instincts were sufficient enough for him to know when to eat and to sleep. Believe me, as a mother, that's a nightmare philosophy. This independence also led young Davis to a suspicion, if not a resentment, of any authority that sought to curb what he thought of as his rights. Samuel was also a Revolutionary War veteran and spoke regularly of his experiences, often peppered with hero worship of George Washington. Davis's brother fought in the War of 1812, so his home was filled with stories of patriotism and the triumph of independence from those powers that oppressed the United States. Meeting Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans, made a huge impression on young Jefferson Davis. He met the future president on his journey from Mississippi back to Kentucky for boarding school. Following an education at Transylvania University in Mississippi, Davis entered West Point, where he graduated with Robert E. Lee and others whom he formed lifelong relationships. Among them were P.G.T. Beauregard, Joseph E. Johnston, and Braxton Bragg. It is true that West Point develops military minds, but in Davis's case, it also molded his character and rhetorical style. He was court-martialed for an incident stemming from the infamous West Point Eggnog Riot of December of 1826, which involved cadets going off base for a night of drinking at a local pub. In what would become a signature methodical approach, Davis restated every aspect of the case brought before him and then demolished it point by point. This type of defense appealed to Davis and offered the most convincing way of demonstrating the correctness of his own view and the error of others. That being said, he often misstated, ignored facts, or glossed over details when they contradicted his view, adding irrelevancies to add weight to his argument. In other words, he learned how to manipulate words. We can see that independent streak Samuel imbued in his son and his questioning of authority during this incident. The case against Davis was dismissed, and Davis could see the convincing power of his arguments, the convincing power that his arguments had over others, and strength that when his honor or conduct was threatened, he would take every pain to prove himself completely right. Upon graduation, Davis served in the United States Army in Wisconsin and Illinois and participated in the Black Hawk War in 1832, as did Illinois militia captain Abraham Lincoln. When captured, the Indian chieftain Black Hawk was placed in Davis's charge. It is stated that the heart of Black Hawk was won by the kind treatment he was provided by Davis, who treated him with much kindness and showed empathy for Black Hawk's situation as a prisoner. After the war, Davis continued serving in the West and managing encounters with various Native American tribes. Davis walked away from the Black Hawk experience with an idea formed about how to treat the underdog, which would later translate in how he treated his slaves. Enjoying a successful military career during which Davis developed a love of being in the field, a sudden exit from Army life occurred in 1835. Some believe the chief reason for leaving was his engagement to Sarah Knox Taylor, daughter of General and later President Zachary Taylor. He greatly respected Davis, but did not want his daughter to endure the difficult life of living on a frontier army post. Once formally separated from the military, the marriage was approved and the couple wed in Louisville, Kentucky. Settling down with his new bride into planter life in Kentucky, the couple was simultaneously struck with malaria. Davis's case was severe, and he would suffer bouts the rest of his life. Sarah's life was more tragically affected. She died 3 months after the couple wed. This loss deeply, deeply affected Davis for the next 10 years. He lived a self-imposed exile on the property of his brother Joseph, who is pictured here. Joseph was about 20 years older than Davis and was far more of a father figure to him than his actual father, who was described as stoic and preoccupied. When Davis married Sarah, Joseph gave them 1,800 acres of property adjoining his own Mississippi plantation, which Davis named Briarfield. Both properties were located in what was called Davis Bend along the Mississippi River. Joseph's home, Hurricane, had a large library filled with shelves of great works of American political history, and it was here that Davis had his first glimpse from Thomas Jefferson that states might set aside federal laws they found objectionable. Davis also learned about slavery from Joseph, who believed that workers as he called them, workers responded to their surroundings and treatment. and humanity and generosity bred character and loyalty. Joseph encouraged education among slaves, allowed them to earn their own money, and clothed and fed them better than most, basically treating them like employees, if you could call it that. Davis adopted these views as well at Briarfield, along with great reluctance to give pain or offense to anyone, especially those who could not fight back. Remember his treatment of Black Hawk. Davis also learned that slaves could be relied upon to fight if given proper leadership, after he led a group of them against some lawless neighbors. More or less, Davis considered slavery a benevolent institution. Blacks were morally and intellectually inferior, yet by providing for their basic human needs and saving their mortal souls through Christianity, they could achieve a decent life and serve their owners well. By 1837, Davis was growing restless of the planter life and went to Washington to apply for an army post out west. Although he didn't obtain a position, he did rub elbows with politicians, heard debates in Congress, and saw firsthand where issues that affected the entire Union were being argued and debated. This experience awakened something in Davis, who had no previous experience with politics. Davis's chance to enter that life came in 1840. He attended a Democratic meeting in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and to his surprise was chosen as a delegate to the party's state convention in Jackson. He attended the convention in 1842 and in 1843 became a candidate for the State House of Representatives, losing his first election. He was selected as one of 6 presidential electors for the 1844 presidential election and campaigned effectively throughout Mississippi for the Democratic candidate James K. Polk. Davis's oratorical skills were getting noticed. His speeches communicated his position of a strict construction of the Constitution, the protection of states from federal the protection of states from federal encroachment. Davis was finally emerging from his grief, a strong states' rights advocate, and in 1845, a married man. His new wife, Verena, said of Davis while stumping, "He took in the individuality of the crowd, and seeing doubt or lack of confidence with him in their faces, he answered with arguments addressed to the case in their minds. He adjusted his comments to the masses, but never talked down to them sufficiently to be regarded as one of them." Others said his words touched intellect, but not passion. This sincerity of opinion, Verena felt, could account for his opponents thinking him to be domineering and close-minded. They would be right, though Davis could never see why. He was surprised and hurt when others didn't see that his conclusions were the right ones. 1845 also brought a new career, U.S. Senator. Jefferson Davis dove into his work, often staying awake until 2 or 3 in the morning. He buried himself in every detail of his job. He exhibited signs of being insecure. He would rather immerse himself in the minutiae rather than let something slip past him. He would repeat this throughout his life. During this first term, he made a big impression with his speech on Oregon, which was then jointly occupied by the US and England. He also further developed his opinion that the federal government had no inherent power. "It is a creature of the states," he said. "As such, it could not have inherent power. All it possessed was delegated by the states." The old desires to be back on the battlefield surfaced as the Mexican-American War began in 1846. Davis resigned his seat in the Senate and sent an open letter to the press encouraging men to volunteer. Given command of the 1st Mississippi Regiment, he reunited with his former father-in-law, Zachary Taylor, for the Battle of Monterey and Buena Vista. It is at this latter battle that Davis earned the deep respect of his men. All day at Buena Vista, they had seen him in their front, risking enemy fire every bit as much as they did. They saw him ignore his own wound, he was shot in the foot, to stay with them in the fight. When the occasion demanded inspiration by personal example and bravery, Davis was magnificent. In addition to being reunited with Taylor, Davis also encountered fellow West Point graduate Braxton Bragg. He came to Davis's aid at Buena Vista when his regiment was in trouble. This encounter forged a mutual admiration between these two men that would last into the Civil War. Though desiring to stay in the Army, Davis couldn't continue with his injury. He returned to a hero's welcome in Mississippi and decided to go back to the Senate. In December of 1847, a seat had been left vacant by the death of Senator Jesse Speet. Davis served the remainder of Speet's term and was elated to be elected later on for a full term on his own merit. A summary of legislation proposed during his term from 1848 to 1851 shows that Davis was interested in acquiring new territories gained from the Mexican-American War as slave territories. And you can see that's a huge concentration of land there. He was interested in maintaining a balance between free and slave states. He argued against succession over slavery, but agreed that each state had an unquestionable right to secede from the Union if it came to that. The Senate gave Davis a platform to share his views on slavery, its benefits to the U.S. and to the U.S. as a whole, and to the slaves themselves. I have no fear of insurrection, no more dread of our slaves than I have of cattle. Our slaves are happy and contented. The only source of misery the slaves of the South have is the unwarrantable interference of those who know nothing about that with which they meddle. Slavery removes the slave from bigotry and the heathen darkness which hangs like a cloud over the country in the interior of Africa, to the enjoyment of all the blessings of civilization and Christianity. Those are Davis's words. Davis also often touched on the fears of Northern and Southern citizens alike regarding free blacks. Upon a large territory, a few blacks might be turned loose without great injury to progress of society. But on a small territory, a large number of blacks would compete with whites for jobs, masses of unemployed Negroes reverting to thievery or the public doles to survive, and worst of all, racial amalgamation. Davis would use this same argument when trying to recruit Southern troops, especially as successes on the battlefield waned. When Congress ended in March of 1831, Davis went home to Mississippi. He didn't stay there long, though. He toured the state talking about the looming threats to Southern rights and slavery. He was asked by the Democratic Party to run for governor again, which he didn't really want to do, but he felt his party needed him to uphold their principles, so he agreed. Davis was unable to stump for himself due to a recurring case of facial neuralgia, which some call the most painful affliction known to mankind. That's up for debate, but nonetheless, it affected his eyesight. Fortunately, in Davis's eyes, no pun intended, he lost that election, but only by a slim margin. At this point, he was ready for arrest, and he returned to life as a planter at Briarfield to watch national politics from afar. 1853 saw a return for Davis to the political arena, this time as Secretary of War under the newly elected President Franklin Pierce. As many politicians are faced with, Davis heard the knocking on the door from men who felt they were entitled to a position in the department. Davis opposed patronage, saying only death, resignation, or incompetence would put any of his clerks in the War Department out of a job. Ironic, considering many of his leading generals 10 years later would be considered as such, yet Davis did not put them out of a job. More about that later, though. Davis may have wished the demise of one general he worked with in the War Department, Old Fuss and Feathers Winfield Scott. Davis called him peevish, proud, petulant, vain, and presumptuous, all attributes that were at odds with Davis's character. Their feuds often went public. Scott published their correspondence in the papers, which was the start of a lifelong struggle between Davis and the press. Despite such hurdles, Davis proved to be one of the nation's most involved and active secretaries of war. He did work with Scott to modernize the Army, and under his leadership saw the introduction of the mini ball, which greatly increased accuracy of shots. He managed the $20 million War Department budget, not the War Department budget, but he managed that budget down to the penny, and among other firsts, tried to introduce camels into service out west. And here's a picture of one of the camels in the Camel Corps. This idea also gave much fodder to the press, as you can imagine, but dissolved shortly after he left his position. As with his Senate position, he dove into the details of his new job and often involved himself in layers of daily operations he didn't need to. It was becoming increasingly obvious that he wasn't a delegator, but he did have leadership qualities. Many were starting to call his name for a higher station. Davis left the Senate in January of 1861 and went back to Mississippi to contemplate how he would be involved in what he must felt was an impending crisis. His farewell speech was one not forgotten for many decades. The gallery was packed. Many senators would say farewell that day. Davis was the last. Observers saw a gaunt, tight man who fought to contain his emotions. I'm sure I feel no hostility to you senators from the North. In the presence of God, I wish you well. Whatever of offense there has been to me, I leave it here. As to the offenses he might have given, I have, senators, in this hour of parting, to offer you my apology. It only remains for me to bid you a final adieu. He exited to thundering applause from both sides. Always reveling about his time in the field as a soldier, Davis considered himself most appropriate to serve the South in a military capacity. Southern leaders, however, had a different role in mind. On February 9th of 1861, delegates from the 6 seceded states met at a constitutional convention and unanimously voted Davis as provisional president of the Confederate States of America. Davis was surprised, but his rigid concept of a public man's duty to respond to any call of the people left him no choice but to accept the burden. Davis was formally inaugurated on February 18th of 1861. From the start, he was sad and regretted the circumstances that brought the South to this point, expressing his hope that the new nation might not have to be born in bloodshed. He acknowledged an uphill battle, though at that point he couldn't have imagined how steep that hill truly was. He had to start a government from scratch with people who had little in common except for a hatred of the North and a death grip on the Southern way of life, which for many included slavery. As with his time in the Senate, Davis dove right in. He had administrative affairs to contend with, but also some larger ones. How could he, if and when a war broke out, how would he deal with prisoners of war? How could he assure a free and open Mississippi River, key to transporting troops and supplies? How would he finance the war in his new country? All this for an annual salary of $25,000. Now, keep in mind, $25,000 doesn't seem like a lot back in today's dollars, but first of all, that was the same salary that Lincoln was making. And today, if you go on the inflation calculator, that equals about $728,000 for an annual salary. Today, President Trump makes $400,000. So there's a little bit of perspective there for you. Still desiring a peaceful resolution, Davis sent a commission to Washington, D.C. with an offer to pay for any federal property on Southern soil, as well as the southern portion of the national debt. Lincoln refused. At the same time, informal discussions took place with Federal Secretary of State William Seward, who hinted that Fort Sumter would be evacuated. Acting on this tip, Davis appointed P.G.T. Beauregard to command all Confederate troops near Charleston, South Carolina, where state officials prepared to take possession of Sumter. Beauregard was to prepare his forces but avoid attack on the fort. When Lincoln moved to resupply the fort with food, Davis and his cabinet directed Beauregard to demand its surrender or else take possession of it by force. Major Robert Anderson, federal commander inside Fort Sumter, did not surrender. Beauregard bombarded the fort, and the Civil War began April 12, 1861. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens claimed that this war was inaugurated by Mr. Lincoln. He acknowledged that Beauregard fired the first gun, But, he argued, the larger truth is that in personal or national conflicts, it is not he who strikes the first blow that begins the conflict. Rather, the true aggressor is the first one who renders force necessary. Anderson eventually agreed to evacuate Fort Sumter, and the South won its first victory. Immediately following the events at Sumter, both sides called for further military action. Davis called for volunteers, as did Lincoln. By April 29th, 36,000 Confederate troops were enlisted, and more coming in by the week. Davis would never see recruits swell in such numbers after this initial period. It was a difficult sell to persuade the non-planter class that this war was as much for them as it was for the roughly 25% of the Southern whites who were slaveholders. Davis tried to reason that their way of life was being threatened, their ability to find work, their economy, their social structure, which was built on white supremacy over Black, and all the traditions that they believed Southern life entitled them to. As I mentioned at the start, I'm not going to go into details of any of the battles fought during the war. Rather, I'd like to focus on, right now, some disadvantages facing Davis in general during his presidency. Manpower. As previously mentioned, there wouldn't be enough as the war went on. The North possessed 4 times the white population of the South. Additionally, the North had the capability to train and equip the soldiers and their arsenals, 100 times the industrial power of the South. At one point late in the fighting, Davis even proposed to his cabinet that he would grant emancipation to any slave whose owner sent him for service. This never materialized. On a related note was Davis's inability to harness Confederate nationalism. Remember when Varina observed in one of Davis's early speeches that he could tailor his comments to a crowd but never talked to them in a way that kind of allowed him to become seen as one of them? This worked to his disadvantage in this case. Davis gave speeches to soldiers and politicians, but largely ignored the common people. The plain old folks of the South resented the favoritism shown to the rich and powerful slaveholding class. Another disadvantage was the vast geography that there was to defend. Davis believed in having troops defend every inch of the country's borders with the North, rather than a general rule of concentrating troops where the trouble was brewing. This, of course, led to very thin resources across the board. This was partly political, partly an effort to affect nationalism. States got upset when troops were pulled from their borders to defend other areas and felt they were being shunned. This was a constant tightrope for Davis, who gained enemies in Southern governors and congressmen over this. Insubordinate generals was also an issue for Davis. Those West Point co-graduates, PGT Beauregard, Bragg, Johnston, all West Point grads, Mexican War vets, and they knew Davis well. Unfortunately, they all failed him over and over again. Yet, out of a sense of loyalty and commitment to old friends, Davis kept them in their positions, even though they were ill-fitted for them. Another disadvantage was the press. Morale fed by the press, in fact. During the war, many Southern congressmen who disagreed with Davis's decisions took them to the press, and several prominent newspapers would publish correspondence between Davis and his enemies in Congress, even those of Southern governors and his own generals and cabinet. I guess that's no different than what we see on the news channels today, except it was done in the press. Davis did not have the personality to schmooze the press, which left him virtually defenseless against their printed pages. Davis also suffered from personal illness, as I mentioned before, bouts of malaria, facial neuralgia, anxiety, and incapacitating blindness, which left him bedridden for many weeks at a time. This prevented him from dealing agreeably and patiently with politicians, the press, critics, and the general public. These maladies were coupled with family tragedy. He lost 2 of his sons before his presidency was over and would lose 3 more after the war was finished. Finally, it's possible that perhaps recalling the victories of his father and brother, the victories that his father and brothers knew in former wars, he could see victory because the South was also fighting for their independence, just as the entire country was a generation ago. Davis took the cause up as a personal one, and as the conflict deepened, he often distorted reality to fit his grand plan of the South, peacefully coexisting with the North, albeit as separate countries. As the war drew to a close, Davis found himself removed from his inaugural capital in Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia, and lastly fleeing to and from a hastily arranged government headquarters in Danville, Georgia. On May 5th, 1865, the official dissolution of the Confederate government occurred as Davis met with what was left of his Confederate cabinet for the last time. It was agreed that Davis head south towards Florida and then perhaps onto Cuba, where he could plan for the Confederacy's future. Davis left the city with several trusted escorts on the 5th and met up with his wife, Verena, and children shortly afterwards. And as the story began, he was captured in what appeared to be a disguise of women's clothing on May 10th of 1865. Adding insult to injury, a train with Davis's personal papers was captured in Florida on June 15th, and the soldiers sent some of his letters to Northern papers where they were published. More than one image of the capture of the Confederate President of the United States also made its way to those papers. Davis was taken to Fortress Monroe on the coast of Virginia. His casemate was cramped, conditions harsh. Guards made rounds every 15 minutes, and a light from an ever-burning candle caused him severe headaches. Public outcry from both North and South poured out when images of Davis in leg irons appeared in the papers, causing widespread sympathy. Davis spent 2 more years under improved conditions after that incident was published. He awaited his trial for treason, which kept getting postponed. He was released in 1867 after the likes of Horace Greeley, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and other prominent Northern and Southern citizens raised $100,000 for his bail. Davis then visited Canada, Cuba, and Europe in search of work. His life as a politician was over. He lost citizenship under the 14th Amendment, which said that, you lose your citizenship and you lose your ability to hold elected office if you have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution of the United States. The treason case against him was dropped in 1869, and after the initial fervor after Lincoln's assassination, it was determined with certainty that Davis had no involvement. Returning to private life, Davis did hold a presidential office again, that as president of the Carolina Life Insurance Company in Tennessee. He avoided many public dedications and commemorations, not wanting to run into some of his former generals. He believed that federal military rule and Republican authority over the former Confederate states was unjustified, and continued to believe in a Southern social order that excluded a democratic white polity based firmly on dominance of a controlled and excluded Black caste. In 1876, a wealthy woman, Sarah, Davis and his family to stay at her plantation. It was well known that Davis lost his job when the Carolina Life Insurance Company folded, and he needed a permanent home. Briarfield had actually been raided during the war, so he was unable to stay there. It was from Beauvoir that Davis penned The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, published in 1881, which we have a copy of in the Garfield Library. The 2-volume book was well received, and Davis toured the country in 1886 and 1887. It was a way for Davis to say his piece, to argue his point of view step by step, just as he did at West Point during his court-martial. He became associated with the Lost Cause movement, which supplied a historic interpretation of the war so that Southerners could maintain their sense of honor. The Lost Cause philosophy stated that the South fought nobly and against all odds not to preserve slavery, but entirely for other reasons, such as the rights of states to govern themselves, and that the South was forced to defend themselves against Northern aggressors. From Beauvoir, Davis also completed a short history of the Confederate States of America in 1889. He then traveled back to his plantation at Briarfield, but was stopped short in New Orleans by illness. He had his ups and downs for 2 weeks and died peacefully on December 6, 1889. His funeral was one of the largest in the South. On December 11th of 1889, the body of Jefferson Davis was carried by a funeral procession through the streets of New Orleans to Medaillé Cemetery. Davis was entombed in the tomb of the Army of Northern Virginia. So the tomb of the Army of Northern Virginia is on the left here, and the entombment of Jefferson Davis is shown here on the right. On May 27th of 1893, his remains were transferred to a new casket and taken by train to Richmond, Virginia for reinterment in the Hollywood Cemetery. This move to the capital of the Confederacy occurred at the behest of his widow, Verena. There are so many markers, plaques, and memorials to Davis. Some of which are being taken down and defaced. And in addition to the physical structures memorializing Jefferson Davis, organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy formed to dominate the Lost Cause movement that Davis himself aligned with, and made the vindication of the South its guiding principle. Their goal was to preserve and transmit Southern traditions. UDC members built homes for aging Confederates, monitored public schools to ensure children were being taught the Lost Cause version of the Southern past, and sponsored scholarships for the study and preservation of Confederate history in both Northern and Southern universities. Generations of children were raised on the UDC version of history, and many of them went on to actively resist desegregation in the mid-20th century. The year before his death, the former president of the Confederate States of America beseeched the young men of Mississippi to lay aside all rancor, all bitter sectional feeling, and to make your places in the ranks of those who will bring about a consummation devoutly to be wished, a reunited country. So at the start of this program, I asked you to think of words that you associate with Jefferson Davis. I'd like to hear some of those words, and then I'm going to share some of my words. So don't let the presentation cloud what your original words were in the beginning. Meredith, can you unmute anybody that might want to?
Traitor.
I think traitor is pretty much what I thought too. But I want to leave you with a couple different words that come to my mind or came to my mind after I finished putting this presentation together. Methodical, detailed, troubled, torn, fiercely patriotic, and loyal to an extreme, and finally, deeply complicated. I hope that I've put some new ideas in your mind that might create a desire for you to learn more about Jefferson Davis.
Can we ask a couple questions?
Hold on, I have something to wrap up here. I have one thing that I didn't address, and that is the dress. So the myth that was spread about Jefferson Davis escaping capture wearing women's clothing. One source states that the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, under President Lincoln, clothed a mannequin in a dress, hoop skirt, and shawl, had photographs taken of it, and distributed the photo or the image to the press. Newspapers ran sketches of the photo like this one here. Later, Stanton claimed to have acquired the actual dress from Davis's wife and held a massive press conference to display it. I'll leave you to figure out or to research what the truth is about this incident, because there are many different versions of what actually happened. Yes, now at this point, I'd be happy to try and answer any questions you have.
Well, I got a couple. I got two, okay?
Okay.
One, the fellow that captured him, did he get the 100,000, which had to be a tremendous amount in that day? And the second question is, why did they drop the case, the treason case, in 1869?
You know, those are two questions that I don't know the answers to. I actually didn't find any information about whether the person who captured him received the $100,000. Because he was part of the military, I don't know if he would have been eligible for that. Maybe it was just open to private citizens who might have seen Jefferson Davis running around the countryside or whatever. So that I don't have the answer to. And why the treason charges were dropped, I'm sorry, I did not research that as part of my presentation. But that is a good question, and I think I'm going to look a little bit deeper into that.
Thank you. Good job. Very good job.
Thank you.
We had a question in the chat.
Okay.
Given his poor health and difficult personality, why was Davis selected as president?
I think, in my opinion, people saw that he had the quality, he did have qualities that would make him a good president. I also think that he kept his health issues very quiet. It was suspicious that he would be closed up for days without any contact with people, but I guess folks just kind of thought that was a personality quirk and left him alone. I also think he was fiercely patriotic and wanted the country as a whole to succeed, even if it was separately. And I think he was recognized for that as well. But if other people have read about Jefferson Davis, I would appreciate hearing your opinions as well. Not to put anyone on the spot.
A number of people were accused of treason and not charged. Samuel Mudd, I believe, was one of them. He served time in the Dry Tortugas, and eventually that was taken away. But I believe he was absolved only by Bill Clinton, perhaps, in recent times. The other comes to mind is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was forgiven by Abraham Lincoln. I think Lincoln and the politics of the time wanted Reconstruction to be successful, and therefore, instead of hammering these people, making it worse than what it was, they said, you're free to go.
Interesting.
I think it might have also been an effort to just try to reunite.
Sure.
An effort on the North's part to reunite the country and try to move forward with,
yep.
with reunification.
Nice job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Good job. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Just a brief advertisement. Peggy and I took a river cruise down the Mississippi. The teacher at that time was the great-grandson of Jefferson Davis. He toured Vicksburg with us, took us to his home, talked about his friends, family, toured the homes of the time, his brother's home there in Vicksburg. I had the chance to ask, his name is Bertram. I had a chance to ask Bertram Davis what happened to the money, because there's this business about the gold being buried somewhere in Georgia. And he said nobody really knew what happened to the money, although he pointed out that Jefferson Davis lived a good life, that maybe he was digging up coins every once in a while from the family treasury buried in a vault under the tree.
You know, that's an interesting thing that you bring up about him living a comfortable life, because from what I was reading, it just seemed like he couldn't catch a break after the Civil War, but then he finally settled into life a little, you know, several years later. And I wonder how much the success of his book played into that, if he made any money off of, especially the, well, I don't know, both of the books that he wrote, I think would sound appealing to the general public.
sort of like Grant. Grant pulled his family out of poverty by writing a book just before he died.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, I got to go. I thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Peggy and Jeff. And if there's
Yeah, one more question in the chat here. Was Davis the unanimous choice for president of the South? Were there no other candidates?
Good idea.
That is a really good question. I don't remember seeing anything about him running unopposed. So that leads me to believe that that he was the unanimous choice. That's something I'm going to have to look into.
Okay.
When I do this program in another 7 years, I will add the information that you guys have asked me about. I'll update it for you.
I'd like to know if his statue is still in the Capitol building. You know, it was there. He was a senator and his statue was there.
Is it in Statuary Hall?
Or have they torn it down now?
You know what? I don't know. I did see some images last night while I was looking online for several statues that were torn down. It looked like many of them were in outdoor spaces. I didn't look that one up specifically, so I'm not sure, but that's a great question.
It was still there 2 years ago when we traveled with him. But
the statue of Jefferson Davis stands in the Capitol building of the United States.
Our Capitol.
Our Capitol building.
Right.
No.
Right.
Huh, that's interesting.
Okay, guys. Do it again, please.
Meredith, anything else?
That seems to be it here.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, if I could just give you, Peggy and Jeff, I know you have to go. If I could just let everybody else know about the status of the Garfield home. So we're working on a plan right now to be able to reopen our visitor center, which is the sort of main point of entry to the site. It's where you get your tickets. We have a movie, exhibits. We're working on how to open that safely. And then, you know, hopefully by mid to end of summer, we'll be able to resume tours of the Garfield home. Our outdoor events like our Civil War Music Festival and Shakespeare have been postponed. So just keep looking for information on our Facebook page and website for future dates.